Somewhere on a cold mountainside, there is a tree. It is not a particularly large tree. It does not have the grand, spreading arms of an oak, or the soft, weeping curtains of a willow. It is a spruce tree. Quiet, straight, patient. And it has been standing in the same cold valley for a very long time. The winters there are long and still, and the snow comes early. The summers are short. And because of all that cold and all that quiet, the tree grows slowly. So slowly. A fraction of an inch each year, perhaps less. And that slowness, it turns out, is exactly what makes it perfect. Because somewhere, years from now, maybe decades from now, a violin maker will come to that forest and stand in front of that tree and listen. Not with a stethoscope or a measuring device, but just with their ears and their hands, the way violin makers have always done. They will knock gently on the trunk. They will tilt their head and listen to the sound it makes. And if it has that particular ring, clear, deep, resonant, they will nod to themselves and say quietly, "Yes, this one. This is the one." And that is how a violin begins. Not in a workshop, not with a tool, not with a plan drawn on paper. It begins in a forest, with a slow-growing tree and a person who knows how to listen. Violin makers have a special name. They are called luthiers. The word comes from the old French word for a lute, which was the instrument people played long before violins were invented, and somehow the name stuck even after violins became the thing that most of them made. Luthier. It is a beautiful word to say, isn't it? Lu-T-I. It sounds a little like music itself. A luthier's workshop is a wonderful place, if you ever get the chance to step inside one. It smells of sawdust and something sweet, wood shavings and varnish and old glue. The walls are hung with tools, little planes no bigger than a hand, curved knives with handles worn smooth, gouges and chisels and scrapers that look almost too delicate to do any real work. Violins in different stages of being made sit in clamps or on benches or hang quietly from hooks, waiting. And everything is covered in a fine pale dust, as if the room has been gently snowing sawdust all day. The luthier, most of the time, is sitting very still, working very slowly, concentrating on something small. That is the thing about violin making. It cannot be rushed. There is no way to hurry it. The wood won't allow it, and the work won't allow it. And after a while, the luthier stops even wanting to hurry, because somewhere along the way, they have learned to move at the speed of the material itself. Which is to say, very, very slowly. Before a single cut is made, the wood must wait. When the spruce is brought down from the mountain, carefully, in wedge-shaped pieces called billets, it is stacked in a dry place and left alone for a year, sometimes 2 years, sometimes 5 or 10. The best luthiers keep stores of wood that have been drying for 20, 30, 40 years. Some use wood that is even older. There are workshops in Europe where shelves of spruce and maple have been sleeping quietly since before anyone working there was born. Why? Because wood is full of water. Living trees carry water from their roots to their leaves, up through tiny channels running all along the grain, and even after the tree is cut, that water is still there, locked inside. And if you try to make a violin from wood that is still damp, still wet inside, it will crack as it dries. It will warp and twist and pull itself apart. All that careful work undone by a little moisture. So the wood waits. And while it waits, it dries out very gradually, very gently. The cells inside settle and tighten. The wood becomes more stable, more reliable. In some ways, more itself. By the time a luthier picks it up and begins to work, the wood has been transforming quietly for years, getting ready, becoming exactly what it needs to be. Isn't that a wonderful thought? That a violin, in a way, begins to be made long before anyone lifts a tool. The violin is already becoming somewhere in a drying shed, in the silence and the dust. A violin is made of many parts, more than 70 separate pieces of wood in total, though most of them are very small. But there are 2 pieces that matter most of all, and those are the top and the back. The top is almost always made of spruce. That same slow-growing, cold mountain tree. The back is usually made of maple. A different kind of wood entirely, harder and denser, with a beautiful wavy pattern in the grain called figuring, or flame. If you have ever seen an old violin in the light, you might have noticed how the back seems to shimmer and ripple, as if the wood is alive underneath the varnish. That is the flame of the maple catching the light. Each piece of wood is different. Each one has its own particular shimmer, its own particular pattern of rings and grain. No 2 violins are ever quite the same, because no 2 pieces of wood are ever quite the same. The top piece of spruce, called the belly, which is an old-fashioned word that just means the front, is split or sawn into two matching halves, which are then glued together along the center with a join so clean and precise that you almost have to look for it. The luthier holds the piece up to the light and examines the grain. The rings of growth run parallel even, close together. Good. This is what you want. Wood that grew patiently and steadily year after year, with no rush and no interruption. Then comes the shaping. The top and the back of a violin are not flat. If you pick up a violin and look at it from the end, you will see that they curve upward. They arch like a very low dome. And that arch is not there by accident, and it is not there to look pretty, though it does look pretty. It is there because it is the arch that gives the violin its strength and its voice. A flat piece of wood, when the strings pull on it and the sound vibrates through it, would flex and bow and eventually crack. But an arch is strong. Think of the arch in an old stone bridge. The curve sends the weight out and down through the stone so that the bridge can hold enormous loads without breaking. The arch in a violin works a little like that. The tension of the strings, the pressure of the bridge, the constant vibration of music, all of it travels through the arched wood in a way that the wood can bear, day after day, for hundreds of years. To make that arch, the luthier takes a flat piece of spruce and begins to carve it. Not with a machine, not with a mold, but by hand, with small curved tools, shaving away a little at a time. The outside of the arch is carved first, and then. Here is the part that requires the most patience of all. The inside is hollowed out. The luthier carves and tests, using calipers to measure the thickness. Here it should be 4 millimeters, here it should be 3. Here, right in the very center where the vibration will be strongest. It might be as thin as 2.5 millimeters. Less than the thickness of a few sheets of paper. Imagine working on a piece of wood that fine. Imagine trusting your hands enough to take a sharp blade to something that thin and keep going, keep shaving, keep listening for the sound. Because the luthier taps the wood as they work, listening to how the sound changes as it gets thinner, knowing by the ring of it how close they are to just right. It takes days, sometimes a week. Slowly, gently, patiently. Meanwhile, the sides of the violin, the ribs, they are called, are being prepared. The ribs are thin strips of maple, the same maple as the back, cut very thin, barely more than 1 millimeter thick. And to bend them into the curves of the violin's shape, the luthier uses a simple but wonderful tool, a bending iron. The bending iron is a heated metal rod something like a thick bar that is kept hot over a small flame or an electric element. The luthier takes a strip of maple, dampens it slightly, and presses it against the hot iron, bending it slowly around the curve, coaxing the wood into the shape it needs to take. This requires care. Too much heat, too fast, and the wood scorches or splits. Too cool, and the wood doesn't bend. It breaks. But at just the right temperature, with patient hands, the maple softens and flows into the curve as gently as if it had always wanted to be curved. Can you imagine bending a piece of wood with a warm iron, the way you might press a curl into hair, coaxing it into shape? That is exactly what it is like. The wood gives a little, yields a little, takes the curve, and holds it as it cools. The luthier works slowly along the strip, section by section, and the flat piece of maple becomes the curved side of a violin. There are two bouts in a violin, two pairs of curved ribs that give it that hourglass shape. Wide at the top, narrow in the waist, wide again at the bottom. Once all the ribs are bent, they are fitted around a mold, a wooden template in the exact shape of a violin, and glued into place, held by small blocks of willow at the corners and the ends, and left to set. And when the mold is eventually removed, what is left is a perfect hollow rib cage, like the hull of a very small boat. The scroll is carved next, or sometimes before the ribs, depending on the luthier's habits. Each luthier has their own way of working, their own order for doing things, their own small rituals and preferences. But the scroll is always carved by hand, and it is perhaps the most beautiful part of the whole instrument. The scroll sits at the very top of the violin's neck, curling inward in a tight spiral. It does not make any sound. It does not do any structural job exactly. It is simply there because it is beautiful, and because it has always been there, and because a violin without a scroll would look somehow unfinished, like a sentence with no full stop. To carve a scroll, the luthier takes a block of maple and draws the shape onto it. That tight, elegant spiral. And then begins to cut away everything that is not a scroll. It is the same principle a sculptor uses. You find the shape that is hidden inside the block, and you remove everything else. The rough outline is cut first with a saw, and then the scroll is refined with chisels and gouges. The spiral cut deeper and smoother, the fluting shaped on either side, the chamfer. That gentle, sloping edge, carved all the way down the peg box. A fine scroll, finished, is one of those things that is difficult to look at without tilting your head and just admiring it for a moment. All that careful carving, and what you end up with, is something that looks perfectly natural, perfectly simple, as if it simply grew that way. Which is, of course, the whole idea. Now comes the purfling. Purfling is a word that sounds like something out of a fairy tale, and the thing it describes is almost as delicate as a fairy tale detail. Purfling is a narrow strip of inlay, a thin border that runs all the way around the edge of both the top and the back of the violin, set into a tiny groove carved just inside the edge. It is made of 3 layers, 2 thin strips of dark wood, usually ebony or dyed pear wood, with a strip of pale maple in between. Together they form a thin, white-black stripe, like the thinnest possible racing stripe, following the curving outline of the violin all the way around. And why does it exist? There are 2 reasons. The first is practical. Purfling helps to stop cracks from traveling inward across the top. If the edge of the violin is knocked, a crack might begin there, but the purfling acts as a barrier, a kind of boundary that the crack cannot easily cross. So it is useful in a quiet way. But the second reason is simply that it is lovely. That thin, dark border makes the outline of the violin sing. It draws your eye to the curve of the waist, the swell of the bouts, the gentle proportions of the whole shape. A violin without purfling would still be a violin, but it would be a little plainer. A little less itself. The luthier cuts the groove for the purfling with a small blade called a purfling marker, working it carefully around the curves. Then, the purfling strip is bent over the bending iron, just as the ribs were, and fitted into the groove, mitered at the corners so that the join is invisible, or nearly so. Then it is pressed in and glued and left to set. And when it is trimmed flush with the surface, what remains is that perfect, clean, dark border, quietly beautiful. Easy to miss if you are not looking. Impossible to forget once you have seen it. Inside the violin, 2 small but absolutely essential pieces of wood are fitted before the top is glued on for the last time. The first is the bass bar. It is a long, thin strip of spruce glued to the inside of the top, running lengthwise beneath the lowest string. The bass bar stiffens the top in just the right way, helping it carry the deeper vibrations of the lower strings, giving the violin some of its warmth and depth in the lower register. It is so small and so hidden that you would never know it was there from outside. But without it, the violin would sound thin and uneven. The second piece is even smaller and even more important. It is called the sound post. The sound post is a tiny round stick, perhaps as thick as a pencil and no more than an inch long. It is not glued. It is simply wedged in place inside the violin, between the top and the back, positioned just behind the treble foot of the bridge, held by friction and the pressure of the strings. And this tiny, unglued, unheld little stick is one of the most critical pieces of the entire instrument. The sound post connects the top of the violin to the back. When the strings vibrate, they set the bridge moving. The bridge sets the top moving, and the sound post carries that vibration through to the back so that both plates are singing together. If the sound post is moved even a fraction of a millimeter, even just a tiny shift, the sound of the violin changes. It might become warmer or thinner, or more brilliant or less focused. Violin restorers and adjusters sometimes spend hours moving the sound post by the smallest amounts, listening carefully after each adjustment. That is how sensitive it is. That is how precisely this little stick of wood has been fitted. A luthier setting a sound post uses a thin hooked tool slipped through one of the F-holes to maneuver the post into exactly the right position. And when it is right, when the tap of a finger on the top produces just that particular ring, they nod and set the tool down and leave the post where it is. The F-holes deserve a moment of their own, because they are another one of those things that look simple and are not simple at all. The F-holes are the two curved openings cut into the top of the violin, one on each side of the bridge, each one shaped like a long, elegant letter F, curving in at the waist and widening at the top and bottom into little round eyes. They let the sound out of the violin. Without them, the vibrating air trapped inside the body would have nowhere to go, and the instrument would be muffled, almost silent. But the shape of the F-holes, and their size, and their exact position, all affect the sound. Wider F-holes let more air move, which gives more volume, but can also change the tone. The position matters too. Move them a little closer together, a little further apart, and the sound shifts in ways that are hard to describe, but instantly noticeable to a trained ear. Cutting the F-holes is one of the most nerve-wracking parts of making a violin, because once you have cut them, you cannot uncut them. The knife goes in and the wood comes away, and that is permanent. The luthier works carefully, following a template, but also trusting their eye, their sense of proportion, their feel for what is right. A few steady cuts, a little tidying with a sharp knife, a smoothing of the curved edges, and there they are. Two small, perfect openings, shaped over centuries of refinement into exactly this form. After the top is glued on, with hide glue, which is made from animal bones and connective tissue and has been used for this purpose for hundreds of years because it holds well, but can also be released cleanly when a repair is needed. The violin is, for the first time, all in one piece. But it does not look like a violin yet. Not quite. It looks like a rough version of a violin, with tool marks in the wood and the edges not yet finished, and the whole surface pale and dry. There is still a great deal of work to do. The neck is fitted and glued. The fingerboard. A strip of hard ebony, the darkest, densest wood used in the violin, smooth and cool to the touch, is glued onto the neck. The nut, a tiny piece of ebony at the top of the fingerboard, is shaped and slotted. The edges of the top and back are rounded and smoothed. Every surface is scraped and sanded until it is perfectly clean, perfectly even. And then it is time for the varnish. The varnish is the part of violin making that has been most argued about, most written about, most wondered over for 300 years. When you look at an old Italian violin, one made in the city of Cremona in the 1600s or 1700s, you will notice that the varnish has a quality that is almost impossible to describe. It glows. It is not just shiny, the way a lacquered table is shiny. It has depth. It looks warm, as if there is a light source somewhere inside the wood. And this quality has led to centuries of speculation about secret formulas, lost recipes, magical ingredients. Was it the varnish that made those violins sound so extraordinary? Was there something in the recipe that nobody has been able to rediscover? The truth, as far as anyone can tell, is that the secret was not one thing, but many things. The wood, the craftsmanship, the drying, the fitting, the varnish, all working together. And the varnish itself was probably not so different from what luthiers use today. Oil and resin, colored with pigments, applied in many thin layers. Many layers. That is the key thing to understand about varnish on a violin. A luthier does not paint the varnish on in one thick coat. They apply it in layers so thin that each one is almost transparent. A coat goes on, and then the violin is left to dry. Sometimes for days. Then another coat. Then more drying. Then another coat. By the time the violin is finished, it might have 15 coats of varnish on it, or 20 or 30. And each layer adds just a tiny amount of depth to the color, and a tiny amount of luster to the surface, until the final result is that warm, glowing quality that makes old violins look as though they are lit from within. The color of the varnish varies. Some luthiers prefer a pale amber, almost honey-colored. Some prefer a deeper reddish brown, like dark cherry or old brick. Some like orange gold. The great Cremonese makers each had their own colors, their own preferences, and the violins they made still carry those colors today. 300 years later, a little faded and worn in places, but still glowing. Which brings us to Cremona. Cremona is a small city in northern Italy, and for several centuries it was the most important city in the world, if you were interested in violins. It was there, in the workshops of a handful of families, that the violin was developed into the shape it has today. The Amati family made them first, and their instruments were already extraordinary. Then came a student of the Amatis, a man named Antonio Stradivari, who would go on to make the most celebrated violins in all of history. And alongside Stradivari worked another great maker, Giuseppe Guarneri, known as Del Gesù, of Jesus, because of the way he marked his instruments. Antonio Stradivari lived to be very old. He was still making violins in his 90s in the early 1700s, and it is said that he had a pile of wood in his workshop that he intended for future instruments, which perhaps he knew he would never finish. He made more than 1,000 instruments in his lifetime. About 600 of them survive. They are played in concert halls around the world today by some of the most celebrated musicians alive, and they are worth millions of pounds, millions of dollars. Some of them have names: the Messiah, the Lady Blunt, the Soil, the Titian. Violins with names, 300 years old, still singing. There is something almost impossible to hold in the mind about that. A piece of wood, shaped by a man's hands in the early 1700s, still producing music in the 21st century. Still breathing in its way. Still carrying sound. Cremona still makes violins today. The tradition never stopped. There are hundreds of luthiers working there, trained at the International School of Violin Making that has been teaching the craft for generations. You can walk through the old streets of the city and, if the windows of the workshops are open in summer, hear the quiet sounds of tools on wood. The same sounds that would have drifted from the same streets 300 years ago. When the varnish is finally done, the pegs are fitted. 4 small, tapered wooden pegs that go into the peg box at the top of the scroll, which the player turns to tune the strings. The pegs are usually made of ebony or rosewood or boxwood, shaped on a lathe to a gentle taper, and then fitted one by one into their holes, reamed to just the right angle so that they turn smoothly but stay put. The bridge is carved and fitted, a thin piece of maple, cut to a shape that is instantly recognizable if you have ever looked closely at a violin. 2 elegant curved legs, a waist, a top with 4 notches for the strings. The bridge is not glued. Like the sound post, it is held only by the pressure of the strings that pass over it. And the thickness of the bridge, the height of the notches, the curve of the top, all of these affect the sound, the playability, the ease with which the strings respond. the fine tuners on the tailpiece, the end pin, the chin rest. All of these are fitted. And then, at last, the strings are wound on. 4 strings. The lowest is G, thick and warm and slow. Vibrating, then D, then A, which is the one most violins are tuned to as a reference, and finally E, the highest, the thinnest, sometimes made of steel, with a voice that can be almost unbearably bright and clear. The strings are wound up slowly, the pitch rising, and then, for the first time since that tree was standing on its cold mountainside, there is music. The luthier draws a bow across the strings, and the violin speaks. The bow deserves a mention of its own, even a brief one, because it is extraordinary in its own right. A bow is a long, thin stick of wood, traditionally made from a wood called pernambuco, which comes from Brazil, and is dense and springy and carries vibration in a particular way. The bow is heated and bent into a slight curve. Cambered, the word is, so that when the hair is tightened, it creates the right arc, the right springiness, the right feel. The hair of a bow is horsehair. Specifically, it is usually the hair from the tail of a horse, white horsehair, traditionally, because it is the cleanest and most even. A standard bow has between 150 and 200 individual hairs, all running parallel, all attached at each end to the tip and the frog. The frog being the small block at the bottom of the bow where the player's hand rests. There is a small screw in the frog that tightens or loosens the hair before and after playing. The horsehair grips the string because it is coated, very lightly, deliberately, with rosin. Rosin is a sticky, golden, crystalline substance made from the sap of pine trees. The player draws the bow cake of rosin across the hair before they play, and the rosin coats the hair, and when the coated hair is drawn across a taut string, it grips and releases it many times per second, too fast to see, too fast to feel individually. And those thousands of tiny grips and releases set the string vibrating. And the vibration travels through the bridge, into the top, through the sound post to the back, out through the F-holes, into the air, and into the ears of whoever is listening. That is sound. That is music. Horsehair on a string, and centuries of accumulated craft and knowledge, and a slow-growing tree from a cold mountain. There is a phrase that old violin makers use, and it goes something like this: the wood remembers the forest. What they mean by it is not mystical exactly. They mean that wood is not inert. It is not like stone or metal, which can be melted and recast into any shape at all. Wood is a living material, was a living material, and it carries within it the record of its own life. The growth rings tell you which years were cold and dry, which were warm and wet. The grain tells you which direction the tree was leaning into the light. The figuring in the maple tells you about the stress patterns in the wood as it grew, the pressures that came from the weight of snow, the pull of wind. And when the violin is made, all of that history is still in there, still shaping how the wood moves, how it vibrates, how it carries sound. The luthier is not building something from scratch. They are having a conversation with a piece of wood that has already lived a long and quiet life. Over time, as a violin is played, the wood changes. The vibrations pass through it year after year, and little by little, the cells of the wood respond. The resonances deepen. The tone matures. An old violin that has been played regularly for 100 years often sounds richer and more beautiful than it did when it was new. Not because anything was done to it, but simply because it has been vibrated over and over again by music. You could think of it as the wood learning. The first time a fine violin is played, truly played, by a skilled musician. There is often a moment of stillness afterwards. The musician will lower the bow and just hold the violin for a moment, feeling it, not speaking. And the luthier, if they are present, will do the same. Because for all the measuring and carving and fitting and varnishing and waiting, for all the years of learning the craft and understanding the wood, the moment of first sound is still surprising. It is still, somehow, more than the sum of its parts. A piece of spruce and a piece of maple and some strips of willow and a length of ebony and a few hairs from a horse's tail. And from all of that, something that can make a person cry at a concert hall. Something that has been making people cry at concert halls for 300 years and more. That is the violin. That is what it is. And somewhere tonight, in a workshop somewhere, perhaps in Cremona, perhaps in a small city in Japan or Germany or the Czech Republic or America, where the craft of violin making has spread and taken root and grown its own traditions. A luthier is working by lamplight, moving slowly. Taking a small plane to the inside of a spruce top, taking off the thinnest of shavings, tapping the wood, listening. The shavings curl to the floor like pale ribbons. The workshop smells of wood and varnish. The luthier is not thinking about the concert halls or the musicians or the hundreds of years of violins before this one. They are thinking only about the wood in their hands and what it needs and what it wants to become. Outside, somewhere cold, a spruce tree is growing slowly in the dark, adding, perhaps, a thin new ring of growth. Patient, unhurried, not yet a violin, but perhaps one day becoming one. And the wood remembers the forest, and the forest is quiet, and the night is very still.